He was the rugged face of Duck Dynasty, the unshakable patriarch who built an empire with his bare hands and unwavering faith. But behind Phil Robertson's iconic beard and swamp-born wisdom was a storm no one saw coming. As millions watched him guide his family through fame and fortune, a silent battle was brewing, one that would threaten everything he stood for. What really happened when the cameras stopped rolling? And how did the mighty fall, not in front of the world, but quietly, painfully, at home? The truth will break your heart. Phil Robertson wasn't just the star of Duck Dynasty, he was its soul. With his unmistakable long beard, deep southern drawl, and unwavering devotion to faith and family, Phil became an unlikely cultural icon. The A&E reality show, which debuted in 2012, brought the Robertson family's hunting lifestyle and business empire, Duck Commander, into millions of American homes. Viewers were drawn to the show not just for the laughs and swamp-filled shenanigans, but for the values it represented: simplicity, faith, tradition, and the strength of family ties. But Phil's story didn't begin on reality television. Long before fame found him, he was a man with a singular vision: to design the most realistic, effective duck call the hunting world had ever seen. In the early 1970s, this vision took root in a humble shed in Louisiana, where Phil crafted duck calls by hand. What set him apart was his dedication to authenticity. His duck calls were not mass-produced gadgets. They were finely tuned tools designed by a man who lived and breathed the sport of duck hunting. Ironically, Phil's journey to becoming a duck call pioneer was a detour from what could have been a high-profile career in professional sports. As a young man, he had a promising future in football. He was the starting quarterback at Louisiana Tech, playing ahead of none other than future NFL Hall of Famer Terry Bradshaw. Coaches and scouts saw star potential in Phil, but he saw something else: a life that would pull him away from nature, family, and the quietude of rural living. To the shock of many, he turned down a chance at NFL stardom to stay close to the land he loved. That choice defined everything that followed. Choosing the wilderness over stadium lights wasn't easy. He and his wife Kay struggled financially for years. They lived in poverty, barely scraping by, as Phil poured everything into building Duck Commander. Yet, he refused to give up. His belief in his craft and faith in a greater purpose gave him strength. Slowly but surely, word spread about his duck calls, and the small family-run business began to grow. What started in a shed would eventually become a multi-million-dollar empire. When Duck Dynasty premiered, the show brought Phil's values and personality into the spotlight. His role wasn't just to entertain, he was the moral anchor of the family. Fans loved his moments of wisdom delivered from the duck blind or around the dinner table. He spoke about faith, perseverance, and the joys of a simple life in a way that resonated across generations and demographics. In a media landscape often filled with conflict and chaos, Duck Dynasty was a comforting contrast, grounded in love, laughter, and prayer. But what viewers didn't see on screen was the full weight of Phil's journey. While he embodied strength, resilience, and leadership, his path had been riddled with hardship and darkness. Before he became the man fans admired, he had to overcome deep personal struggles that nearly tore his family apart. Phil Robertson's rise from small-town hunter to national figure was not a story of overnight success. It was the result of hard work, sacrifice, and a refusal to compromise on the values that mattered most. Even as fame and fortune followed, Phil stayed true to who he was. He still hunted, he still preached, he still gathered his family around the dinner table to pray. But behind the bearded icon and booming voice was a man whose past was darker than fans ever imagined. Demons of the past. Behind the composed and faithful figure that fans saw on television was a man who had once been consumed by chaos. Long before Duck Dynasty made Phil Robertson a household name, his life was marked by turbulence, poor decisions, and deep personal flaws. The polished image of a strong patriarch was the result of a long and painful transformation that came only after hitting the lowest point a man can reach. In his early adulthood, Phil was far from the faith-driven leader he would later become. Though he had always loved nature and thrived in the outdoors, his personal life spiraled out of control. He drank heavily, often allowing alcohol to dictate his actions. This behavior made him unpredictable and volatile, straining every relationship around him. His temper flared easily. He was prone to outbursts. He lived with little regard for the impact his choices had on others. His wife, Miss Kay, bore the brunt of his recklessness. She had married Phil with hopes of building a stable and loving home, but what she encountered instead was heartbreak. While she tried to shield their young children from the instability that Phil brought into their lives, it became increasingly difficult. His behavior jeopardized their family's unity and safety. He would disappear for days, neglecting his responsibilities, lost in a cycle of drinking and anger. Miss Kay remained steadfast, holding on to hope that the man she married still existed beneath the surface. Her love did not waver, even when she had every reason to walk away. Friends and family urged her to leave, to protect herself and her children. Still, she waited, believing in the possibility of change. That faith would eventually be rewarded, but not before Phil pushed his family to the brink. The turning point came when Phil was forced to confront the wreckage he had created. Alone and estranged, he reached a moment of reckoning. He saw the pain in his children's eyes. He realized the weight of what he was losing, and for the first time, he understood that he could not continue down the path he was on. In that moment of desperation, Phil made a decision that would alter the course of his life forever. He sought redemption. He turned away from addiction and toward faith. It was not an overnight transformation. Trust had to be rebuilt slowly. Miss Kay and the children had endured years of emotional scars. Forgiveness would take time, but Phil was determined. He humbled himself and began to study Scripture. He sought spiritual guidance. He committed to living a life of purpose, one rooted in the values he had once abandoned. Phil's newfound path was difficult, but he stayed on it. He took responsibility for his past and worked to become a better husband and father. Slowly, the man Miss Kay had believed in began to re-emerge. His children saw a different side of their father, one who was present, patient, and principled. The same intensity he once devoted to self-destruction was now focused on building a future. That future would become Duck Commander, and later Duck Dynasty. When viewers eventually met Phil on their television screens, they saw a man of wisdom, faith, and composure, but few knew the depths of his earlier struggles. His calm strength had been earned through pain. His devotion to family was born from nearly losing them. The grace he extended to others came from understanding what it meant to be broken and redeemed. His past was never forgotten. It remained a quiet reminder of the life he had once lived and the second chance he had been given. It shaped his outlook, guided his parenting, and influenced his spiritual teachings. For Phil, redemption was not just a personal triumph. It became the foundation of everything he stood for. What the world saw was the result of a man who had battled himself and won. But life had more challenges in store. Just as the dust settled from the battles of his youth, a new and unfamiliar struggle began to take shape, not in the heart, but in the body. Just as Phil found peace and purpose, new cracks began to form, this time within him physically, setting the stage for a battle unlike any he had faced before. The beginning of a silent battle. For years, Phil Robertson embodied the image of endurance. He could outwalk, outwork, and outlast almost anyone. Even as age crept in, he remained a powerful figure on screen and off, moving through swamps with purpose and sharing wisdom without hesitation. To the public, he still seemed unshakable, but time was quietly carving its marks into the man who had once seemed invincible. Subtle signs appeared first. The once vigorous step of the outdoorsman grew slightly more cautious. His words, though still sharp and meaningful, began to slow. Family members noticed, but at first, no one spoke openly. They reasoned that it was only the natural rhythm of aging, the consequence of decades spent in the wild, braving the elements. Years of crouching in duck blinds and hauling game through muddy terrain had worn on his body. Still, he pushed forward, unwilling to admit anything was wrong. The moment that forced everyone to look more closely came in 2023. While performing what should have been a routine task, loading an aluminum boat, Phil injured his back. It didn't seem like a major incident at first. This was a man who had dealt with broken bones and bruises for most of his life. But something about this injury felt different. The pain lingered longer than usual. His movements, already slower, became more limited. He winced with effort. His family watched with growing concern, though Phil brushed it off as a temporary setback. True to his nature, he didn't complain. Pain to him was just another part of the daily grind. He had endured worse, and he expected to bounce back, but healing didn't come. Instead, his discomfort deepened and his mobility declined. The body that had once trudged through freezing swamps with ease now hesitated at each step. Still, the family kept their worries private. No one wanted to believe that their father and patriarch, this symbol of toughness, might be facing something more serious. Then came the second injury, the one that couldn't be ignored. In early 2024, Phil suffered another devastating blow to his back, fracturing several vertebrae. The damage was undeniable. This time, it wasn't just a lingering ache or pulled muscle, it was a turning point. The man who had always led from the front now needed help to get through the day. For the Robertson family, this was unfamiliar territory. They had seen Phil survive hardship before: poverty, addiction, and emotional turmoil. But physical limitations were new. Watching him struggle to move without pain was deeply unsettling. Jace Robertson, one of Phil's sons, eventually addressed his father's condition during an episode of the Unashamed podcast. With a voice full of emotion, he revealed what had previously been kept quiet. Phil was not improving. The tone shifted from hopeful to somber. For the first time, there was public acknowledgement that something larger was unfolding. Fans who had once seen Phil as a symbol of grit and vitality began to worry. Behind the cameras, the family rallied around him. They adjusted their routines, offered support, and tried to make sense of the changes they were witnessing. Despite everything, Phil never lost his inner strength. He remained committed to the principles that had always guided him: faith, family, and perseverance. But he could no longer pretend his body wasn't breaking down. His resilience had reached its physical limits. The silence around his suffering gave way to quiet conversations and heartfelt concern. The man who had taught others how to navigate life's challenges now needed help facing his own. Yet even as his body betrayed him, no one could anticipate the news that was still to come. The physical battle was only the beginning. Something deeper, more elusive, was growing beneath the surface. The next revelation would shake the foundation of everything the family had known about their father's strength and clarity of mind. Just as they began to adjust to Phil's physical decline, an even more devastating discovery loomed, one that would threaten not only his body, but his very sense of identity. A diagnosis that shook the family. The Robertson family had always leaned into hardship with unshakable faith. Through financial struggles, personal crises, and the challenges of fame, they stayed united. But when Phil's physical pain escalated into something deeper and more persistent, even their collective strength began to show signs of strain. After the second back injury, Phil's condition steadily worsened. He became less active, less talkative, and more withdrawn. Small tasks he once performed with ease now required effort. The family noticed how often he sat quietly, lost in thought. Concern turned into urgency. Miss Kay and the children urged him to see specialists. They hoped the issue was something manageable: a pinched nerve, chronic arthritis, anything with a clear path to recovery. But the tests revealed something no one expected. Phil was diagnosed with a serious blood disorder. It had likely been developing for years, slowly weakening his body without obvious warning. The disease, a chronic condition affecting his blood cells and immune system, explained the fatigue, the lingering pain, and his body's inability to bounce back from injuries. This wasn't just wear and tear from years in the wilderness. It was a condition attacking him from within, relentless and largely invisible. The diagnosis was a moment of reckoning. For decades, Phil had seen himself as a survivor. He had rebuilt his life from the ashes of his past. But this time, the fight was different. There was no single enemy to confront, no external obstacle to overcome with sheer will. The illness was internal, quiet, and insidious. His strength, once his defining trait, was now being slowly drained away. The news devastated the family. Jace, who had already opened up publicly about Phil's physical struggles, now carried an even heavier burden. Speaking to fans and followers, he revealed the painful truth. Phil wasn't simply getting older, he was sick. Jace's voice cracked as he shared the reality of watching his father, the man who had taught him everything from duck hunting to spiritual discipline, grow weaker by the day. There were treatments available but no cure. Doctors offered ways to manage the symptoms, slow the progression, and ease the discomfort, but none of them could reverse what had already taken hold. Every decision now came with weight. Which procedures were worth the risk? Would the side effects be worse than the disease itself? These were not questions the Robertson family had faced before. Now, they became part of everyday conversation. Phil, true to his nature, didn't let despair take root. He remained grounded in Scripture, leaning on prayer and quiet reflection. He accepted the diagnosis without fear, believing that his life had always been in God's hands. But his physical limitations became more visible. His walks grew shorter. His presence at family gatherings became less frequent. He spent more time in silence, often seated outside near the water, watching the land he had loved for so long. The man who once led his family with booming speeches and contagious energy was now leading with stillness. His strength no longer came from physical action, but from resilience of spirit. Those around him adjusted. They began to take on more responsibilities. The younger Robertsons became protectors instead of followers. Each of them, in different ways, began preparing for a future without Phil at the center. Just as the family began to settle into this new reality, another discovery emerged, one even more heartbreaking than the first. The changes in Phil's behavior, once attributed to physical fatigue, had another explanation. Moments of confusion, forgotten conversations, and misplaced belongings hinted at something deeper. A second diagnosis confirmed their fears. Early-stage Alzheimer's. The shock hit harder than anything before. Phil's mind, his storytelling, his guidance, his unwavering wisdom had been the heart of their family. The idea that this part of him could slip away was nearly impossible to accept. This time, the pain was emotional. The family wasn't just watching Phil slow down. They were witnessing the potential fading of the man they had always turned to for clarity. The man who had built their family traditions, who had taught them how to live with purpose and love, was now facing the gradual erosion of the very memories that defined him. As Phil's strength faded and memory grew fragile, the family faced an unthinkable future. What would become of the empire he built when even his own identity began to blur? The cruelty of memory loss. Phil Robertson's voice had long been the compass of the family. His stories, passed down from generation to generation, were more than entertainment. They were lessons, memories, and traditions bound together by conviction and faith. To imagine a world where those stories might be forgotten was something his loved ones never anticipated. But now, they were being forced to face that unimaginable reality. It started with the smallest details. Phil would misplace tools he had used every day for years. He would forget a name in the middle of a conversation. Sometimes, he would pause mid-sentence, struggling to recall what he was about to say. At first, these slips seemed harmless. After all, everyone forgets things now and then, especially as they grow older. But with Phil, these incidents became more frequent. Miss Kay noticed first. She had known him better than anyone, and she recognized that these were not ordinary lapses. There was a difference in his eyes, a hesitation in his speech, and an unfamiliar distance in his demeanor. She kept these worries to herself, hoping she was overreacting. Still, her heart felt heavy. The confirmation came when the doctors delivered their second diagnosis. Phil was showing early signs of Alzheimer's disease. The condition was progressing slowly, but the implications were clear. Over time, his memories, his ability to process information, and his connection to the past would begin to fade. The strength of his mind, once a defining feature, was now under threat. For the family, this diagnosis carried a pain unlike anything they had faced before. With the blood disorder, they had braced themselves for physical decline. They could help him sit down, support him when he stood, and ease the burden of daily tasks. But how could they fight something that slowly erased his connection to everything he loved? Jace, once again, gave voice to what the others struggled to express. In a raw moment shared with listeners of the family podcast, he admitted that his father was not the same. He spoke about the difficulty of watching Phil cry out in pain, and how his once sharp memory now flickered unpredictably. These weren't just changes in health. They were signs that the man they looked up to was slipping away. The impact was profound. Phil had always been the storyteller. He could recall hunting trips from decades earlier, describe each moment with vivid detail, and bring lessons from the past into the present. Around the dinner table, he had often led the family in prayer and reflection, tying together old wisdom and present truth. Now, those stories began to lose their structure. His sentences wandered. His thoughts sometimes became tangled. This shift affected everyone differently. Miss Kay clung more tightly to every moment they shared, determined to preserve the version of her husband she had always known. The children found themselves stepping into roles Phil once held, trying to balance leadership with grief. Even the grandchildren sensed the change. They had grown up listening to Papa's stories. Now they leaned in closer, hoping to catch every word before it disappeared. Yet, despite all of this, Phil's spirit remained strong. His faith never wavered. Even when he stumbled with words, his prayers remained heartfelt. He still found peace in the outdoors. He still smiled when surrounded by family. There were good days, moments of clarity, times when the past came rushing back like a flood. And during those moments, the family held on to hope. They knew what lay ahead. Alzheimer's is a path filled with uncertainty, but they were committed to walking it together. They began documenting more of his memories, recording conversations, gathering photographs, and preserving everything they could. Not out of fear, but out of love. They wanted future generations to understand the depth of who Phil was, even if one day he could not explain it himself. With Phil's memories beginning to fade, a new chapter was approaching, one where the family would have to carry the Robertson legacy without his guiding presence on screen. Duck Dynasty without its patriarch. For many fans, Duck Dynasty had always been about more than hunting or backwoods humor. It was a window into a way of life rooted in values often forgotten in modern times. Family dinners, shared faith, and hard-earned success were the pillars of the show's appeal. At the heart of it all stood Phil Robertson, the quiet force who shaped every message and memory that played out on screen. So when news broke that Duck Dynasty would return for a special revival, anticipation grew quickly. Loyal viewers were eager to see the next generation of Robertsons take center stage. Willie, Corey, their children, and even the grandchildren would now carry the story forward. It was an exciting shift, one that celebrated growth and continuity. But there was one unmistakable absence. Phil Robertson was not returning. The man whose presence had anchored the original series would no longer appear in the revival. Fans waited, hoping he might show up in a small segment, perhaps sitting at the dinner table or offering a quiet prayer. Some thought he might at least be seen in the background, watching his family carry on the traditions he had taught them. But as more episodes aired, the truth settled in. Phil was not part of the new story. For the Robertson family, continuing without Phil came with emotional weight. He had been more than a cast member. He was the original builder of their brand, the founder of Duck Commander, and the spiritual voice of the entire operation. His absence felt like the loss of a compass. No matter how capable the next generation proved to be, there was no replacing the man who had laid the foundation. Behind the scenes, the decision was not made lightly. Phil's health had changed the rhythm of his daily life. He needed rest, peace, and the presence of loved ones without the constant pressure of production schedules. While cameras had once followed his every move, he now found comfort in privacy. The physical and mental challenges he faced required a different kind of strength, one that could not be captured through a television screen. Yet, even as he stepped away, his influence remained visible. Every family prayer, every shared meal, and every lesson passed down in the revival echoed Phil's original teachings. The values he had preached, faith, loyalty, hard work, continued to shape every episode. His children and grandchildren carried his legacy forward, not just by honoring him, but by living the way he had always taught them to live. Viewers noticed, fans wrote letters, posted messages online, and shared personal stories of how Phil's words had affected their lives. Many had come to see him as a father figure or mentor, even from afar. His disappearance from the screen felt personal. They had grown up watching him. Now, they were watching him fade into the background of a story he had once led. The revival, while heartfelt and genuine, carried a more reflective tone. It was no longer just about duck calls or funny moments. It had become a story of transition. A new generation was stepping up, not to replace Phil, but to protect what he had created. There was pride in their voices when they spoke about him, and often a touch of sadness too. At home, Phil continued to live close to the land he loved. He spent his days surrounded by nature, often sitting with Miss Kay or sharing quiet moments with his children. Though his public appearances had ended, his lessons continued to flow through the people he had raised. He may no longer have been on screen, but his spirit still shaped every word and gesture shared by his family. Now, as the Robertson family takes the reins, one question remains. How will they protect Phil's legacy in a world that moves faster than the values he held so dear? The legacy that lives on. Phil Robertson's story began with a simple dream, one rooted in faith, family, and the quiet strength of rural life. That dream evolved into an empire, touching millions across the world. Even as he stepped away from the spotlight, his presence remained woven into the very fabric of the Robertson family. His legacy was never about fame or financial success. It was always about building something that would endure. Within the family, his influence is seen in the smallest details. Meals begin with prayer, conversations circle back to faith, and decisions are guided by principles passed down through generations. These moments are not performed for an audience. They happen quietly in kitchens, on porches, and during walks through the woods. For Phil, those were the places where life mattered most. Willie, Jace, Jep, and their children have grown into the roles Phil once filled. They speak with confidence, offer wisdom, and lean on one another during challenges. Each of them carries a piece of his voice, whether through the way they lead, the values they teach, or the way they approach life's obstacles. His absence has not weakened the family. It has reminded them to hold even more tightly to what he spent a lifetime building. Outside the home, fans still write letters, send messages, and share how much Phil's words meant to them. They remember his honesty, his unwavering beliefs, and the way he spoke about difficult topics with clarity. For many viewers, he wasn't just a television figure. He was someone who helped them rediscover their own values, reminded them of lost traditions, or inspired them to reconnect with family. In schools and churches, Phil's speeches continue to circulate. Video clips of his stories and sermons are used in classrooms and sermons alike. His life, with all its imperfections and triumphs, is often presented as an example of what redemption looks like. His journey from addiction and broken relationships to spiritual leadership gives hope to those who feel lost. Even the landscape around the Robertson home speaks of Phil's legacy. Trails he once walked are now shared with grandchildren. Tools he once used have been passed down to younger hands. Stories he once told are now repeated by those who grew up listening to him. His presence lingers in the rhythm of everyday life, a steady reminder of what matters most. What do you think is the most powerful lesson we can learn from Phil's life? Share your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear your perspective.